Our keynote speaker is Professor Sabelo Ndlovu Gatsheni, one of the foremost scholars to engage with decolonial theory and practice in the fields of African history and politics, knowledge production, and higher education, among other topics. Professor Ndlovu Gatsheni's work highlights and investigates what he calls the resurgence and insurgence of radical decolonial African thought and Black traditions. And his work includes drawing out the parallels between Latin American decolonial thought and African knowledge production and theory from the likes of African and African diasporan thinkers such as Ali Mazrui, Walter Rodney, Oyeronke Oyewumi, and Nkiru Nzegu. Professor Ndlovu Gatsheni is a historian and theorist, and his previous positions include research professor and director of scholarship at the Department of Leadership and Transformation at the University of South Africa, where he, prior to that, was the acting executive director of the Change Management Unit in the Vice Chancellor's office of the same university, where he also practically engaged with and fostered processes of decolonizing the university. Prior to that, he held positions at CMU. He was the head of the Archie Majefe Research Institute for Applied Social Policy, and he's also the founder of the Africa Decolonial Research Network, ADRN, that is based at the University of South Africa. Since spring of this year, he is the chair of epistemologies of the Global South at the University of Bayreuth. He's a prolific writer with more than 100 publications to his name, including 9 edited and 8 sole-authored books. And I'm sure these numbers are set to rise further soon. Among his latest monographs is Decolonization, Development, and Knowledge in Africa, Turning Over a New Leaf, that was published this year with Routledge. So we could not have wished for a more fitting keynote speaker for today's kickoff conference. And with that, I warmly welcome Professor Sabelo Ndlovu Gatsheni. The floor, or rather the screen, is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Percy, for the introduction, and thank you to the Global Partnership Network for inviting me. I was actually requested to address a very broad question of coloniality, global coloniality, and the partnerships in the present century. So it means I will focus specifically more on the question of knowledge rather than the other areas of partnership in which a global partnership network is involved. And my first remarks relates to the necessity of global partnerships before I go into some of the challenges which we'll need to take into account. I think this event is taking place at a very opportune moment, and indeed a moment where the issues of global partnerships are very necessary. It is a moment, if we build on the work of Emmanuel Wallerstein, is a moment where we have uncertainties of knowledges, and we have the challenge of really reorganizing the world of knowledge so that perhaps we can be relevant once again. And it is a moment again where we were witnessing what I would call an epistemic crisis, whereby the knowledges which have carried us for over the last 500 years are actually showing signs of exhaustion and giving rise to institutional, systemic, and ideological problems. And the other reason why it is important to think about partnerships today is because we want to address some of the pertinent issues of cognitive injustices, particularly the non-recognition of other ways of knowing. And I think the other major reason why we should think about global partnerships today is also the main issue of we're living in a world which, for lack of a better term, is characterized by planetary human entanglements. And those planetary human entanglements, by their very nature, they require us that we cooperate and we partner in dealing with some of the issues which we're facing. And this issue of partnerships also speaks to one of the major issues of our incompleteness if we are not working together. And if we partner, we therefore enrich the knowledge and the scholarship. Already, Aram Zaya has spoken about another reason why we we need to do the partnerships today, which is the issue of tapping into those knowledges and those epistemologies and those theories and concepts which are arising from the global south, particularly the epistemologies of the global south, opening up the knowledge. For the past 500 years, we've been relying more and more on a knowledge of a minority of the world. And the issue of opening up to the global south is actually opening up to the majority world of knowledge. And I think those are some of the reasons which I thought we need to reflect on as we meet to speak about global partnerships today. But I will go straight to the topic which I was given, which is the topic of the global coloniality in the domain of knowledge. And I will try to, first of all, try to define what we mean by global coloniality in the first place before we talk about its implications for global partnerships. By global coloniality, we actually were naming the continuation of the colonizer's model of the world. That is always not amenable to sustainable and equal partnerships, because at the center of global coloniality is still some of the resilient questions of treating other people as unequal with others, and therefore preventing the whole possibility of working together, of solidarities and co-presence. To be precise, the question of global coloniality is the question of trans-historic expansion of colonial domination. And today you are speaking about its perpetuation in the contemporary times. And this might sound very strange to some people who believe that the decolonization of the 20th century actually delivered a post-colonial world and a post-racial world. From a decolonial perspective, the central argument is that the dismantlement of direct colonial administration did not result in a post-colonial world and a post-racial world. In fact, we moved from direct colonialism or direct juridical colonialism to global coloniality. And that global coloniality is really spatialization of colonial-like relations at a planetary scale. We can also, because when we're thinking about the partnerships of this century, we need to really perhaps drill deeper into what are the problematic issues which cascade from the whole problem of global coloniality. I think the best way to think about the problems of today, particularly if we draw from the work of decolonial scholars, is to think deeply about the question of being human at the present moment. And think deeply about that question, particularly how do we use partnerships to subvert what colonialism imposed, particularly the issue of social classification of global population in accordance with race and its racial hierarchization. I think that's one aspect which we need to address, and that aspect of hierarchization and social classification of human population in accordance with race has implications for knowledge itself, because those who are pushed into the subcategory of subhumanity, their knowledge is generally then devalued, and it is very hard to then have sustainable and equal partnerships, with some people still being considered as subhuman. And it has also a third component, which is the component of the modern global power structures. One of the issues about the partnerships of this century, we must actually make sure that they address and they indeed speaks truth to asymmetrical global power relations which sustain inequality. Inequality not only in terms of human beings, but inequalities also in terms of knowledge production. And they indeed directly challenge some of what we call colonial matrices of power, which sustain the North-South divide that is dominant today. And in line with that, I want us to then think also about what is it that sustains these problematic patterns, colonial patterns, as Aram Zia put it. And I think one of the usable concepts which can enable us to understand these problems better is the concept of the cognitive empire. And that concept of the cognitive empire takes us to the very core of some of the roots of the problems. That the roots of the problem of today, which affect partnerships, are actually rooted in the history of the empire itself. And there is no way we can think about these partnerships in lofty terms without really addressing the question of the empire, which has given birth to the cognitive empire. And I will be very simple here. I'm thinking here about, when we are thinking about empires, one of the most well-known empires across the world is the physical empire, which comes, conquers, and administers people. And the second one is perhaps the commercial non-territorial empire, which controls the world through such tentacles as and the agencies as the World Bank, IMF. But I'm here speaking about another empire which is rarely spoken about, particularly the empire, the cognitive empire, which invades the mental universe of a people in such a way that it destroys some of the knowledges while it privileges some of the knowledges. And I think when we're thinking about these partnerships, we need to think deeply about that reality. And that takes us to another important aspects which we need to consider when we are thinking about global partnerships in this century. That is the question of the global economy of knowledge. There is an emerging argument which is very, very useful for us to put our heads together, that perhaps some people think it does not make sense today to think about knowledge of the South and the knowledge of the North. And they're building on that idea which I introduced at the beginning of planetary human entanglements, that were so entangled that to some people it no longer makes sense to think about knowledges of the South and the knowledges of the global North. A very interesting argument, but I think we still need to drill a bit deeper into understanding the fact that even though we wish knowledge was like that, issue knowledge by now should actually be a commonwealth of all human beings. And we might even speak about what one of the historians from Asia talked about as the Republic of Letters. The reality on the ground is a bit different in the sense that there is still asymmetrical power relations between the global North and the global South in the knowledge domain. The global North, particularly Europe and North America, they are still very dominant in knowledge production. And one of the issues which we need to reflect on is the issue of the uneven intellectual division of labor in the knowledge domain, in which most of the scholars located in the global South, they are still more preoccupied with the hunting and the gathering of raw data, whereas the theory, the concepts, and the models come from the global north, and then they are voraciously are consumed in the global south in terms of attempt to apply them in that environment. And speaking here as an active academic and intellectual, I'm speaking about really a practical problem whereby the tendency is to reduce the scholars from the global south to be area studies specialists, if not native informants. And this actually create what Pauline Ntonji, the philosopher from Benin, spoke about in terms of intellectual and academic dependency. And that is very manifest, even very practically, in terms of where do the scholars of the global south publish their work? Most of the prestigious international, so-called international journals, they're actually located in Europe and North America. And for purposes of promotion, of status and recognition and validation, you will find the scholars from the global south still having that burden of seeking to publish in the global north. I don't want to go into the other details, but the problem is not only the global north. The problem is also inside us, the intellectuals from the global south, particularly because of our process, how we were formed as intellectuals. We can't say because we're located in the global south, we're therefore free from the impact of the westernized global university system. It produced us in a particular way, in the sense that we then develop a very complex consciousness, and that complex consciousness of trying most of the time to run away from your history, to run away from your language, to run away from your culture, and they try to capture other people's languages and other people's cultures. And that is a problem which also us in the global south we need to take seriously. And those who want to understand what I'm talking about in a deeper way, they can refer to the work of again the philosopher Pauline Ntonji, who raised about 13 indices of intellectual and academic dependency of the people from the global south in the global north, and I don't want to go into that. But at the same time, I don't want to create an impression that there is passivity in the global south. The people of the global south are just the way they were produced by colonialism, and they are therefore just passive in the face of the power dynamics, in the face of complex interpretations of being human, as well as the knowledge. There is a lot of initiatives, negotiations, resistances, and the struggles for epistemic freedom coming from the global south, speaking truth to this uneven intellectual division of labor. And again, I don't want to go into most of the issues, but I wanted to highlight some of the highlights of this struggle. Particularly, I'm using this term epistemic freedom, drawing from my book, Epistemic Freedom in Africa, Deprovincialization and Decolonization, where I argued that this epistemic freedom is the right to make sense of the world from the vantage point of African experience and to engage partnerships that advance the key African struggles and aspirations. And this actually links very well with the ongoing struggles in Africa and the global south in general, where there is a vigorous attempt to decolonize the universities as institutions of production of knowledge. And that this is not a new question, it's a question which has preoccupied the people of the global south for some time. And you can also, if you want the highlights of all these struggles, you can refer to what was taking place at the University of Nairobi in 1968 to 1969, where there was even this call for the abolition of the English department. I'm raising all these issues because the issue of partnerships needs really not to therefore ignore the issues which are arising from the global south. It means actually taking them seriously into the agendas of the cooperation. The example perhaps of the Council for the Development of Social Science based in Dakar, Côte d'Ivoire, becomes a very interesting one in the sense that it is an independent intellectual space which pursues research funded externally, but without losing its agenda of producing Africa-centered knowledge. Another issue which I will raise in passing is the impact of neoliberalism on partnerships and knowledge. Particularly, I will think about this from also the vantage point of my previous location in Africa, whereby because of neoliberalism or Washington consensus and structural adjustment programs, there's a tendency, the impact was actually to destroy the public education sector, particularly the public university. And there was redefinition of knowledge itself, that knowledge then becoming in service of the capitalist imperatives, to the extent that because of desperation, you found the academics from the global south moving between two extremes, consultancy and sycophancy. Sycophancy in terms of praising the dictatorial regimes, and the consultancy allowing themselves to be used by those with money to do the research which is determined from outside. I wanted to raise that because it's something which we normally don't speak about when we speak about these issues of partnerships. But I don't want to go on and on, but I want to end and conclude by actually talking about our planetary decolonization of today and the implications for partnerships. And I'm drawing this question of planetary decolonization of today from the insurgent and the resurgent movements such as the Roads Must Fall and the Fees Must Fall movements, which have put, once again, the question of decolonization on the planetary stage. But I want to end by talking about what can we do in these partnerships to resolve some of the problems which I have just raised, and which I think Aram Zahia also raised. And the issue of the dominance, he called it Eurocentrism, the overrepresentation of knowledge from the global north. And secondly, the overrepresentation of that knowledge in theory and in education. How do we deal with that? I think one of the decolonial interventions have been trying to give us the language and the concepts which we can use to deal with that question, particularly the concept of moving the center coming from Ngugi wa Thiong'o, as well as the concept of shifting the geography and the biography of knowledge. I think the partnerships needs to take those concepts very seriously if we are to proceed. And the very issue which I spoke about at the beginning, if indeed it is true that there is an epistemic crisis, it means that part of the agenda of the partnerships of this century is to rethink thinking itself in such a way that we come up with another knowledge which takes us out of the present crisis into the future. And bringing in a very basic argument like, can you use the same knowledges which plunge us into the present crisis as the same knowledges which can take us into the future? I don't think it's as easy as that. And another key element in these partnerships, global partnerships, which we need to take seriously, and again, thanks to the work of the indigenous peoples movement, the feminist movements, and the decolonial movements, is the issue of the emphasis that as we do the partnerships, we need to be prepared to unlearn some of the cultures, the attitudes of coming from a colonial model of the world, so that we relearn another way of relating to each other in a better way. And I want to end by saying we're meeting at a very, very interesting moment where there is profound dissatisfaction with the dominant and the hegemonic knowledge, and where there is really what some will call an epistemic interregnum. The knowledge which took us to the present is exhausted but is not dead. The one which is supposed to emerge is not emerging as fast as it's supposed to. So we have, in the Gramscian sense, an interregnum. But what we need partnerships for epistemic reconstitution. I think there's that importance that we don't only critique the dominant knowledge, but we must be critiquing while at the same time doing reconstitution of knowledge, involving embracement of what I will call ecologies of knowledges, and also thinking across traditions and adopting perhaps what Cornell calls mosaic epistemology. And the global North and the global South needs to, in order for these partnerships to be sustainable, we need perhaps to acknowledge our incompleteness without each other. Human beings being indebted to one another, and the knowledge flowing from various provinces of the world to enrich the human experience. And it's speaking really in terms of the reality of the human condition being about mobility of beings, mobility of things, mobility of commodities, and mobility of ideas. And this realism must form a strong basis for partnerships as the secure future in knowledge production and beyond. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sabelo Ndlovu Gatsheni, for this very inspiring and I dare say tasking keynote. I think you have given us a lot of food for thought, and you've given us some clear points to investigate and to hold ourselves accountable as we are progressing on this path of partnership, where you tasked us to really consider the uneven power relations, to question received knowledges, and to ask ourselves how we can actually move beyond critique towards epistemic reconstitution and towards mosaic epistemologies. I believe there are many things in what we've just heard that we can and should revisit at the GPN. I'm looking forward to this ongoing debate. However, right now, we want to invite all of you who have witnessed this keynote to engage in discussion with our keynote speaker, specifically to ask questions. So we would like to invite you to do one of two things. You could ask a question in the chat simply by typing it in the chat, or if you prefer to speak and raise your question, you could type a plus sign into the chat, which we will then use as a speakers list to call on you to ask your question. Now, we have about 20 minutes of discussion time, for which reason we would like to ask those of you who speak, also in respecting the time of everybody else, to keep your question to a maximum of 2 minutes. And I'd like to politely and kindly remind you that a question is something that is rather brief and succinct, and something that has a question mark in the end. So with that, I would like to open the floor for questions. Okay, I see that Devan Pillai would like to raise a question. Yes, please.
Yes, Thank you, Aram, and thank you for a very inspiring opening address, which I thoroughly enjoyed. There was one thing that you mentioned, which I wanted to latch onto, because this is a debate now that's re-emerging, but it's always there, about the post-colonial perspective and the anti-imperialist perspective, which can be a very nourishing and necessary counterpoint to the perspective of modernity, of Western modernity. However, it can also be a very narrow perspective, a nativist perspective. For example, the current debate, I've just seen a brilliant critique from someone in Jordan, regarding what's happening in France and the beheading, etc. And the inability of countries and peoples in the developing world to introspect in as much as they engage in a strong critique of colonialism, but the inability to introspect in relation to their own issues and a sense of perpetual victimhood, and how to get that balance right, I think is a major challenge. So for example, in Zimbabwe, the anti-imperialist rhetoric of Robert Mugabe just camouflaged his own looting of his economy and its repression of his own people. We have a similar problem in South Africa, as I'm sure you are very, very familiar with. We don't necessarily blame, well, we don't, we have a different colonial experience, or what people call internal colonialism. So we don't blame everything on the external. We blame, some of us blame everything on the white people as a proxy for the external imposition, without looking, much more critically at at the full array of challenges that we face. And I know, coming from a Marxist perspective, although I'm also open to all these other perspectives, the universalizing logic of capital not being lost in our necessity to look at the particular in our social formations. So it's that dialectical relationship. And I like what you said about the need for all of us as partners to have that convivial, you didn't use the word convivial, but I'm sure you meant that convivial interaction, in order to enhance the synergies of all our different perspectives, including Western perspectives, where they are valuable. So it's not a question, I suppose that's the question. Is that what you would agree with?
Okay, thank you, Devin, for raising this question. And I would like to give Professor Ndlovu Gatsheni opportunity to respond directly.
Thank you, Devin Pillay, for that that question. It's a haunting question, if I may put it that way. It's a haunting question, and it's a question which is also very necessary, in the sense that the decolonial project has its own darker side, if I might say, in the sense that there are some versions which are nativist, ghettoist, which are really about closure rather than opening. I'm for decolonization as an opening rather than as a closure. I'm for decolonization whereby it's a recognition of the diversity of the human species. I'm also for a decolonization which does not then degenerate into a psychology of victimhood, to the extent that everything which is problematic, you then project it externally, and you don't do introspection. I like the work of Frantz Fanon, for instance, in the sense of talking about pitfalls of consciousness. But I also link that again with colonialism, without necessarily saying a person like myself, produced by a modern university, I have my own pitfalls born out of the way I was produced as an intellectual. And I can't actually then project my problems outside. I need to introspect first before I even project them outside. So I really accept that caution needs to be always maintained as we embark on these struggles of decolonization, because they are struggles. As struggles, they are never perfect. As you know, it's different schools and also internal tensions within the decolonial movements. You can go back to people think the necrochutist movements. You can see the tensions, but as people confront what they think is a common problem, there are always pitfalls, and I will accept that that they are indeed. That is not a discourse which then say be irresponsible and blame others. No, is not what we're advancing.
Thank you for this answer. I would now like to raise a question that was put to you in the chat, and I'll read it out for everybody. The question comes from Carlos Mario, and he writes, 50 years ago in Latin America, Orlando Fals Borda published a book called Own Science and Intellectual Colonialism. Later, he developed the participatory action research method. Can we account that attempt as an epistemic reconstitution? Or towards which perspectives should go this epistemic reconstitution that you have mentioned?
Indeed, there is a question and an answer to the question in that question as well, because this example which is given is indeed an interesting part of a critique. Then you follow it up with a practical action. But the reconstitution of epistemology, which I'm thinking about a reconstitution of epistemology in its plurality. And when I'm talking about this plurality, I'm thinking we can't say the knowledge of the West is no longer useful. That won't be true. It is still useful. It might be exhausted. When we say something is exhausted, we don't mean it's no longer useful. It is still useful. And the element of its exhaustion is an open window, which then say, what about the other knowledges? How can you bring in the other knowledges so that we deal with this question of exhaustion? And they deal with the question not only of exhaustion, and they confront openly and they embrace the question of plurality of people. We always argue that we have nothing against Europe per se, we have nothing against North America per se. What we are against is when North America and Europe pretend to be the center of the world. That is not true. It's not the center of the world. There are many other provinces of the world. So when people speak perhaps about reprovincializing Europe, pushing Europe to be an important part of the province of the world rather than the center of the world, then other provinces of the world also bring in whatever they have. That is my thinking about the reconstitution of knowledge in the 21st century.
Thank you. I would like to directly follow up with another question from the chat where our own Tata Diawara is asking, thank you a lot for the incredibly rich input. What is a decolonial perspective's stance on the progression of digitalization on the African continent, for instance, in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area? Is digitalization manifestation of developmentalism being a part of a dominant epistemic realm, which is experiencing a crisis, or does it also bear possibilities with regards to local knowledge?
Well, that's an important question. I think that's a question which really addresses the main issue about where does the question of technology sits in the whole broader question of decolonization. I don't think the decolonization we are talking about is to reject technology per se. Is actually to make technology work for the people. If the digitalization actually advances the prospects of human life, because the challenge which we're having, I'm not sure whether all people will agree, the challenge which we're having is the challenge of the fate of humanity here on earth at the present moment. And the decolonization is not a romantic view, it's really about the fate of humanity today. And if technologies can advance that, why not? Why not use digitalization? There's no reason why you can fight with the technology. Technology, as long as it enhances a human life, is fine. But you remember the concept which Achille Mbembe is developing these days, the question of techno-molecular colonialism, that technologies can also exacerbate the inequalities in a way. We need to be careful as we use them.
Thank you. Now, since I guess people are gathering their thoughts, oh, and you are receiving thanks for the answers given so far. I might just quickly use the opportunity to raise a question myself as the moderator. Now, my question has to do with linking.
To reach out to you and say, we've got to do this ourselves, guys. You know, test yourselves, stay vigilant, stay safe,
Hubertus?
yourself. You can't rely on those tests.
Hubertus, I'm sorry, yes, thank you. Okay, sorry about that. So my question has to do with linking the crisis of knowledge you alluded to and the opening that you spoke to with the question of the climate crisis. And particularly, I'm interested in the unequal impact that is also racialized in terms of how people across the globe are impacted, both in terms of people on the African continent and also, people of color in Western diaspora. So my question is, from a decolonial angle, how can we negotiate the introduction of such knowledges that can make visible these unequal impacts in the context of a playing field that is hierarchized, as you described?
No, thank you so much about that question on climate question. I think the decolonial thought has actually revealed that I think there was a major problem from the way capitalism itself unfolded and the modernity unfolded. Unfolding in the sense that it redefines human and the nature relations in a particular way, particularly the idea that nature is really a human resource which is available for the human to exploit ad infinitum. I think there was a foundational crisis there already, roots of a foundational crisis there already, and the idea that the human is not part of nature. I think again, they will begin to see the problems, the root of the problems, and they were not surprised by the consequences today. That because of that type of thinking, whereby you are thinking in dualistic terms rather than in terms of compositionality and the holism, you then end up actually relating to the environment in such a way that you destroy yourself in the process. And that's the consequence which we are facing at the moment. And your question actually then speaks to how do you deal with this issue of differential impact of climate change without changing the system itself. So the major value of decolonial thinking is to take us back to big questions, big questions about structures, systems, and the institutions, which needs to change in order to change also to alleviate or mitigate the impact of this. And the idea that we have an environmental crisis, I always come from this perspective of the relationship between knowledge and the reality, that perhaps epistemology frames ontology. Some of the things which really manifest as systemic, structural, they are fundamentally epistemic in origination. And that's why I like the GNP intervening in the knowledge space, because if you change many of the things in the knowledge space, you can change so many other things at the institutional and the systemic level, particularly the question of inequalities and all this. And the major problem about today is that the moment of the COVID-19 pandemic itself has revealed that maintaining inequalities actually threatens even those who benefit from the inequalities. So it's important that in the post-COVID world, we actually sober up to this reality that maintaining geographies of poverty and geographies of opulence, some of the problems which you expected to affect the geographies of poverty, it comes to actually haunt you as well. So we need really to think as survivors. As survivors, you think as survivors, and you think from a survivor consciousness that all of us were affected and all of us were human beings. I think that's a major lesson.